Welcome to History Teller. Here, we explore the past to learn and remember.
Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer, because we are about to trace the epic and honestly surprisingly embarrassing character arc of ancient Rome. You know, before it was that colossal empire of gleaming marble and godlike emperors that we all picture in our heads, it was something entirely different. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how a tiny, muddy settlement of runaways transformed into a millennium-spanning titan.
To keep a massive 1,200-year history from getting totally overwhelming, we're going to navigate through 5 structured chapters. We'll go from the myth and the mud to the kings and the republic, through their Roman villain arc, into the imperial golden age, and then finish up with the chaos and the collapse.
All right, Chapter 1, the myth and the mud. Let's start right at the very beginning.
Now, it is almost absurd to contrast Rome's grand, world-dominating legacy with its messy, entirely illegitimate origins. And the crazy thing? The story doesn't even start in Rome. It actually kicks off about 25 kilometers away in an ancient city called Alba Longa, right around 771 BC. Basically, a king named Numitor gets overthrown by his greedy younger brother, Aemilius. To make absolutely sure no one comes for his stolen throne, Aemilius forces Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin so she can't have any heirs. But she gets pregnant anyway. And her excuse? She claims she was visited by Mars, the god of war. I mean, sure, what a convenient alibi, right?
Well, the resulting twin boys, Romulus and Remus, have a truly bizarre 3-step origin story, because Uncle Aemilius is definitely not buying that whole Mars story. He orders the babies to be tossed into the Tiber River. But instead of drowning, step 1, they somehow survive and wash ashore. Step 2, they are found by a female wolf named Lupa, who literally nurses them with wolf milk until a local shepherd finally takes them in. And step 3, these so-called demigod teenagers grow up, march straight back to Alba Longa, and overthrow their evil uncle.
But here is where it gets interesting, because this legendary city was ultimately founded on sheer pettiness. Having developed a bit of a taste for leadership, the twins decide to start their own city. The problem is, they can't agree on where to put it. Romulus claims the Palatine Hill because he saw 12 birds fly overhead, a clear sign from the gods, obviously. Remus claims the Aventine Hill because he saw 6 birds and basically calls his brother a cheating liar. So Romulus just starts building a tiny wall anyway. When Remus jumps over it to mock him, Romulus completely loses it and kills his own brother. So yeah, Rome was literally founded on a petty sibling feud and a corpse.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Kings and the Republic. Let's see how they managed to build a functioning society out of that mess.
Early Rome was essentially an asylum city. It was just a magnet for runaways, criminals, and exiles. And over the next 2 centuries, it cycled through 7 different kings. We start with Romulus himself, who sets up the Senate and then, well, mysteriously vanishes in a storm. Sure. Following him, we get this rapid-fire succession of kings building temples, digging sewers, and putting up city walls. But this whole era hits a massive brick wall with the 7th king, Tarquin the Proud. This guy was a tyrant. He was so brutal that the Romans finally snapped, kicked him out in 509 BC, and swore a blood oath to never, ever be ruled by kings again. So to prevent another tyrant, they invented a republic, led by 2 elected consuls who only ruled for 1 year and could veto each other. A brilliant system, which kicks off Chapter 3, the Roman villain arc.
You see, everything was actually going pretty well for this new republic until a massive, traumatic incident completely rewired Roman psychology. The ancient Gauls swept down, invaded the city, looted everything, burned Rome to the ground, and forced the survivors to pay this humiliating gold ransom. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a trauma that shifted Rome's mindset into becoming a relentless machine of conquest. Their new logic was brutally simple. If we conquer absolutely everyone around us, no one will ever be strong enough to burn our home again.
And that paranoid, aggressive mindset fueled massive geopolitical shifts, which really played out across 3 brutal conflicts known as the Punic Wars. We literally see Rome go from fighting over Sicily and scrambling to reverse engineer captured enemy ships in the First War to barely surviving legendary invasions in the Second, all the way to deciding in the Third War that their rival, Carthage, simply shouldn't exist anymore. They didn't just beat Carthage, they completely destroyed the city and enslaved every single survivor. And speaking of that Second Punic War, just think about the number 37 for a second. That number represents the legendary war elephants that the Carthaginian general Hannibal somehow managed to march over the freezing, treacherous Alps. It was an absolute marvel of ancient military logistics and an existential threat to Rome.
Yet amazingly, Rome just absorbed the blows, adapted, and still managed to defeat Hannibal.
Now, with Carthage completely wiped off the map, Rome absolutely dominates the Mediterranean. And this power vacuum sets the perfect stage for a guy who needs absolutely no introduction, Julius Caesar. This guy conquers Gaul, invades Britain, and grows so extraordinarily popular and powerful that the Senate actually orders him to disband his army. But Caesar being Caesar, he just crosses the Rubicon River, marches his army straight into Rome, wins a massive civil war, hangs out in Egypt with Cleopatra, literally fixes our calendar into the 365-day version we still use right now, and basically starts collecting political titles like their Pokemon cards.
But here's the thing about absolute power. It makes people really, really nervous. Those famous 23 stabs on the Ides of March, that was 60 panic-stricken senators abruptly ending Caesar's ambition because they were terrified he wanted to make himself a king. So they stopped him in his tracks in 44 BC.
Now, the Senate totally thought that assassinating Caesar would save their precious republic, but instead, the sheer public fury over his murder launches us right into Chapter 4, the Imperial Golden Age. Because an ultimate showdown immediately kicked off. Caesar's best friend, Mark Antony, and Caesar's 18-year-old adopted heir, Octavian, initially teamed up to hunt down the assassins. But you know how these things go. Soon enough, they turned on each other. Mark Antony heads to Egypt and falls for Cleopatra. Octavian, who is a total masterclass in PR, brilliantly uses this as propaganda, telling the people of Rome that Antony is handing their glorious empire over to a foreign queen. This whole rivalry culminates at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian totally crushes Antony, making himself the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world.
And Octavian was smart. He clearly learned from Caesar's fatal mistake of looking too much like a monarch. He doesn't call himself king or dictator. Instead, he rebrands himself as Augustus, simply the first citizen. He brilliantly stabilizes the empire by restructuring the military, paying soldiers directly for 20-year terms with guaranteed pensions and land. It was a masterstroke that bought their loyalty and kicked off the Pax Romana. We're talking about 2 entire centuries of relative peace, booming international trade, and absolute golden age engineering.
Actually, scratch that, it wasn't all perfect peace and quiet. The vulnerability of the empire is perfectly captured by this tragic, haunting quote from a devastated Augustus. In 9 AD, Germanic tribes ambushed and completely annihilated 3 full Roman legions, that's 20,000 men, in the dark, dense Teutoburg forest. It was such a shock that Augustus spent his final days wandering the halls of his palace, literally crying out in sheer desperation for his lost general Varus to give him back his legions.
And that lingering instability on the borders, it heavily foreshadows the darker days ahead, which brings us to our final chapter, Chapter 5, Chaos and the Collapse.
Because after Augustus died, the whole imperial succession devolved into a series of just truly terrible, unhinged bosses. I mean, we get Caligula, who went completely mad and allegedly tried to make his literal horse a consul. Then there's Claudius, who the Praetorian Guards actually found cowering behind a curtain before they dragged him out to make him emperor. And finally, you have Nero, a guy who executed his own mother and infamously watched half of Rome burn to the ground before finally ending his dynasty via suicide.
But here's what's so fascinating. Despite that chaotic, sometimes straight-up insane leadership in the capital, the Roman imperial machine was so well built on the ground that it just kept expanding on autopilot. By 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, Rome reached its absolute geographical peak, stretching all the way from the borders of Scotland deep into Iraq. But, as we know, you can only stretch a rubber band so far before it snaps. By 235 AD, the empire completely broke down into what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Guys, it was a total disaster. We are talking about 26 different emperors cycling through in just 50 years, and almost all of them were assassinated. Add to that hyperinflation completely destroying the currency, plagues wiping out millions of citizens, and relentless grinding invasions from Germanic tribes in the north and the Persian Empire in the east.
And so the grand empire we just spent this whole explainer building up finally begins to unwind. Emperor Diocletian realizes the empire is just way too massive for one guy to run, so he splits it into a western and eastern half in 285 AD. A bit later, Constantine moves the capital out east to Constantinople. And finally, completely overwhelmed by a massive migration crisis of fleeing Goths, the West just buckles. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Ottowasser deposes the very last Western emperor, and in a cruel twist of historical irony, that emperor was a 16-year-old kid named Romulus. The guy who started Rome and the kid who lost it, same name. the Western Empire was officially done.
But wait, remember that muddy little homeless camp by the Tiber River we talked about at the start? Its spirit wasn't actually dead yet. While the West collapsed into a bunch of fragmented Dark Age kingdoms, the eastern half of that split managed to survive. Known today as the Byzantine Empire, it thrived for another 1,000 years. It preserved Roman law, Roman culture, and Roman architecture right up until Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought on the sheer weight of Rome's legacy. Just look at that journey. We went from two mythological twins saved by a wolf, fighting a petty turf war over a tiny dirt wall, to a sprawling society whose laws, calendars, and architecture quite literally still shape the modern world we live in today. It really invites us to step back and consider, how does such messy, chaotic, and muddy origins echo through history forever? And ultimately, what really makes an empire truly immortal? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning history, and I will see you in the next explainer.